Hey everybody, and welcome back to Frontend Expert. In this video, we will be looking at generators and generator functions, which are functions to create generator objects. And these are objects that we can use as iterables that we can iterate through. Now, let me show you what I mean. So to define one of these functions, we use the function keyword like any other function, but then we add an asterisk after it, and then we just give it a name. So let's call it gen numbers. And then inside of this function, we can write normal JavaScript code with one exception that we get an extra keyword, and that is yield. So what yield does is it's very similar to return, but it pauses the function where it was, and we can yield multiple times, allowing us to resume the execution of this function. So for example, let's yield 1, and then we can yield 2, and then yield 3. So now when we call the gen numbers function, we can save the result in a variable, and this will be our generator object. So let's call this generator, and we can save this as the result of gen numbers. Okay, so now with this generator object, we need to call generator.next. So what I'm going to do is just console.log generator.next, and what generator.next does is it executes the function until it gets to a yield keyword. So in this case, it's going to end up logging out this object with the value of 1 and done as false. So what value of 1 means is that this is the value that was yielded, and done equals false means that we haven't gotten to the end of the function. We can also do generator.next.value to get just that value. And if we added multiple of these generator.next console log statements, you can see we log 1, 2, and 3, each with done as false, but if we tried to log one more time, we would get done as true, and the value would be undefined. Now, we can also add a return statement inside of gen numbers, so for example, I could return 4 here, and now you'll see we get the value of 4, and this one just says done of true here, so we don't need to go to another iteration to see when we are done iterating through the generator. And as you might expect, if we have any code after this return statement, so maybe yield 5, this is not going to work. So we are never going to reach that yield 5 code, and we will just end up with a value of undefined, and done will still be true. Now, one more point about the general syntax here is that with a generator function, it needs to be a standard function. So we can't use an arrow function here. I couldn't do something like this. That just isn't valid syntax, so it won't work. So you need to use a standard function such as we have here. And we can also pass in values to the generator function. This works just like any other function. So for example, we can pass in a count, and maybe now what we can do is add a for loop. So we can say for let I equals 0, I is less than the count, and I plus plus. And what we're going to do is simply yield I. And what this is going to do is just like you expect, it's going to iterate however many times we have count and yield the current index. And then once we get to the end of count, we're going to be at the undefined done as true value. So for example, if we say gen numbers of 3, you can see in the output we have value 0, value 1, value 2, and then we end up on these undefined values which have done of true. We can also iterate through the generator using a for of loop. So I could say for value of generator, and this will work very similarly. So for example, we can say console.log of value, except it's only going to get the value, so it's not going to get the whole object. So now you see we get 0, 1, and 2. The other thing to note here though is that this will essentially just ignore return statements. So if I had a return statement at the end here that was return 5, we aren't going to see 5. It's not going to get this value in the for of loop. So usually I avoid for of loops unless I know there's not going to be an explicit return statement. So it's just something to know about. It's good to know, but usually this can end up leading to bugs where you miss that return statement. So I don't always recommend actually using it. So for now, let's go back to our console.log statements. And we can also pass in values to the generator function through these calls to generator.next. So for example, let's change this function away from the for loop and instead say something like const value equals, and we will just say yield 0. And then the next yield, we will say yield value plus, let's say 3. So now let's go to the second generator.next call and let's pass in a value. Maybe let's say 5. And I will get rid of the other generator.next calls that we aren't using. So now what this is going to do is on the first iteration, it says const value equals yield 0. So here we are simply yielding 0. So generator.next has the value of 0 and done is false. But in the next call, we pass in 5 to generator.next. And what this says is make 5 be the return value of whatever we yielded to previously. So on line 2, where we said yield 0, we saved this in a constant called value. So now value is set equal to whatever we call with generator.next. So generator.next had 5, so value is now 5. So now we are yielding value plus 3, and thus we end up with a value of 8. Now there are a few other functions that we can call on the generator object. So first, we have this function generator.return. And what generator.return does is it's very similar to just having a return statement inside the generator function. So for example, we can return 5 here. And then what I will do is console.log out this value as well. So we can wrap this in console.log. And you'll see that now we end up with a value of 5, done is true. And then this last console.log we never even hit, or when we do hit it, the value is actually going to be undefined because the genNumbers function has already returned. And if we didn't have a return value here, so if we just did generator.return, we end up with a value of undefined. And very similar to generator.return, we also have generator.throw, and this works almost the exact same way, the difference being that we pass in the error that we want to throw. So this is going to actually throw an error rather than just ending the function. So for example, we can pass in new error and say there was an error. And now when I run this, you will see we still get the value 0 because that happened before we threw the error. But then when we throw the error, we get this error message, there was an error, and we never end up hitting this last console log because of the fact that we've thrown an error. So we never even get to this portion of the code. Versus when we returned, we still got to the next console log because we were still running our code. Whereas this throwing an error is actually going to halt execution, unless of course we had a try catch inside of the genNumbers function to catch this error. Okay, so now let's remove this error code and let's take a look at how we can have generator functions that call each other. So in genNumbers, let's get rid of this code and let's first say we want to yield to another generator. So let's say we have generator1 and we can call the generator function. Now, when we yield to another generator, instead of just using the yield keyword, we will say yield star. So let's yield to generator1 and generator2. And now we just need to define these two functions. So we can create the generator1 function first. So we'll do function and we need the asterisk again, generator1. And let's have generator1 yield 1, and then we can yield 2. Now let's create generator2. So we can say function, add the asterisk, generator2. And in this one, I will yield 3 and then yield 4. So what's going to happen here is when we call genNumbers, it's going to yield to generator1, meaning that it's just going to, for the next values, keep using generator1 until generator1 finishes, till it returns, till the done value is true. And then it's going to continue and it's going to yield to generator2. And we can even add our own values in the middle here if we wanted. So we could yield, say, 2.5 here. And now we would yield this 2.5 before getting into generator2. So let's create some generator.next calls to see this in action. So we will first get rid of this count variable because we aren't using that. And let's console.log generator.next a few times. So we can add this a few different times. And you'll see now when I run this, we get 1, 2, 2.5, 3, and then 4. And of course, if we added one more generator.next call, we would end up getting undefined because we are at the end. And of course, we could also do this with the for of loop, which would be a little bit more concise. So we can say for value of generator, and we can console.log the value. And we would get 1, 2, 2.5, 3, and 4. And that's going to be the end of this video on generators. We don't tend to actually use these a lot, but they are really good to know about. They can be helpful in some situations, as well as they can just come up in some technical interviews, so you'll want to know about them and know their syntax. So that's going to be the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you in the next one.